46 hours without sleep. 12,000 acres of endless darkness. Arthur thought he was alone inside his massive 18-ton combine, until a shadow stepped directly into his headlights and waved for him to stop. Steel never gets tired, but the human mind has a breaking point. And out in the dark, something was waiting for him. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only on the high plains of northern Montana just before the harvest begins. It is vast, heavy, and indifferent to human ambition. Stretching endlessly toward the Canadian line, 12,000 acres of ripe, dry wheat sway under a late July sky, moving like a golden ocean beneath a sun that shows no mercy. For the crew at Redline Agriculture, this land was not a landscape, it was a clock. The contract had arrived late, backed by a corporate farm management firm that measured success purely in acres per hour. The terms were brutally simple: strip all 12,000 acres in 5 days flat. If the crew met the deadline, a $40,000 completion bonus was theirs. If they failed by even a single hour, they would forfeit 10% of their base pay. The crew boss, Dale Pute, knew the math was merciless. It meant running heavy iron around the clock without pause, without mechanical failure, and without a single mistake. To lead that charge, Dale turned to his best hand, Arthur Vance. At 28 years old, Arthur was a quiet, lean man built for long hours and hard work. He was not given to idle talk, nor did he panic when things went sideways in the field. He was the kind of operator who sat down in a machine and stayed there until the job was finished, earning a reputation across 3 states as a man who simply did not break. To anchor the operation, Dale assigned Arthur to the flagship of the fleet, the John Deere S790. Standing 12 feet tall at the cab, the green and yellow Titan was an absolute mechanical apex predator. Packing a massive 617 horsepower engine and swinging a 40-foot header across its front, the S790 was designed for total destruction of crop fields, capable of devouring 60 acres of heavy wheat every single hour under peak conditions. It was a fortress of modern engineering, insulated, air-conditioned, and fitted with high-intensity LED floodlights designed to turn night into day. As the sun sank low on the evening before the start, Arthur stood in the staging dirt, looking up at the towering green machine. Steel does not feel fatigue, and hydraulic systems do not care about sleep. The machine was ready. Arthur took a slow breath, climbed the iron ladder, and prepared to step into a rhythm that would test every limit he possessed. 4 o'clock in the morning on the Montana prairie is a cold, pitch-black void. The air carried a bite that belied the blistering heat promised by the afternoon sun, biting at Arthur's jacket as he climbed the iron ladder into the cab of the John Deere S790. Inside, the cabin was a quiet sanctuary of glass and modern technology. Arthur settled into the leather seat, adjusted his mirrors, and turned the key. The massive 13-liter diesel engine roared to life, a deep, guttural rumble that vibrated straight through the floorboards and into his chest. 617 horsepower woke up in the dark, sending a steady pulse through the frame of the machine. He switched on the light bar, and a wall of brilliant LED illumination cut through the gloom, turning the standing wheat ahead into a bright, golden stage. Arthur lowered the 40-foot header until it hovered inches above the soil, engaged the threshing mechanism, and pushed the hydrostatic lever forward. The S790 lunged ahead. The spinning reel swept the top of the crop into the auger, and the mechanical roar of the rotor filled the cab, a rhythmic, continuous crunch as the machine began to chew its way through the landscape. Golden grain poured steadily into the 10,000-liter holding tank behind his head, while a fine mist of straw and dust sprayed from the chopper at the rear. By 6 in the morning, the horizon bled from deep purple into a brilliant, fiery orange. The sun crested the endless expanse of the northern plains, and within 2 hours, the temperature spiked into the mid-90s. Outside, the dust was suffocating and the heat radiated off the dry dirt in shimmering wave. Inside, Arthur was enclosed in a climate-controlled bubble, wrapped in air-conditioned comfort, isolated from the element. The rhythm took over. drive forward, monitor the header height, execute a sharp, sweeping turn at the headland, align the tires with the previous swath, and push the throttle back down. When the grain tank reached capacity, the radio crackled softly. A support truck pulled up alongside, matching his exact speed across the bumpy ground. Arthur extended the discharge auger without slowing the combine down by a fraction of a mile per hour. Thousands of pounds of wheat streamed into the truck on the fly. By hour 8, Arthur had cleared nearly 480 acres. It was a flawless, textbook performance. The John Deere was performing like a masterpiece, and Arthur felt in total command. By hour 9, the blinding afternoon glare began to soften into long, purple shadows that stretched across the stubble. The sun dipped below the rim of the earth, leaving behind a wide, bruised expanse of sky. In the staging area, shift changes were taking place. Other operators climbed down from their rigs, stretching their backs, lighting cigarettes, and rubbing the dust from their eyes. The radio crackled on the console. It was Dale, his voice rough with static. He told Arthur that the support crew was falling slightly behind on the western quadrant, but Arthur was running way ahead of schedule. Dale asked if he could push through into the night, just a few extra hours to secure the momentum while the weather held fine. Arthur reached for his water jug, took a long pull, and radioed back a simple, calm affirmative. He was feeling good, the machine was operating flawlessly, and there was no sense in breaking a winning stride. As night fell over the prairie, total darkness swallowed the field. Arthur flipped on the full LED lighting package arrayed across the front and sides of the giant green machine. A brilliant, stadium-grade beam of light sliced through the black, carving out a sharp 50-yard sanctuary of visibility in front of the header. Outside that beam lay absolute, empty nothingness. Inside the quiet cab, Arthur adapted to life on the move. He never slowed down. He unwrapped a sandwich with one hand while keeping his eyes locked on the edge of the uncut crop, adjusting the steering wheel with his knee or a light touch of his fingers. He drank water, monitored the digital diagnostics on the touchscreens, and kept the hydrostatic lever pushed forward. When nature called, he managed without ever taking his foot off the gas or letting the machine pause, utilizing an empty bottle he kept by the side of the seat. Around midnight, the clock passed the 16-hour mark. The rest of the harvest fleet looked like distant fireflies scattered across the dark ocean of wheat, their lights flickering miles away. Arthur's eyes were starting to feel scratchy, coated in a subtle film of fatigue, but his hands moved with total, automatic precision. The constant, low-frequency hum of the S790's 600-horsepower engine became a hypnotic lullaby, vibration vibrating through his boots, keeping time with the endless, steady fall of the golden wheat. The sky began to pale around 4 in the morning, shifting from an ink-black void to a bruised, cold gray. The second sunrise of Arthur's shift was devoid of beauty. It was simply a harsh reminder that time had lost all meaning. He had been sitting in the air-conditioned cabin of the John Deere S790 for 20 continuous hours. Physical fatigue was no longer a mild inconvenience, it had settled deep into his bones. A dull, throbbing ache radiated up his lumbar spine, radiating into his shoulders and neck from holding the same rigid posture for a night and a day. His eyelids felt like sandpaper, burning every time he blinked, and a stale, metallic dryness rested on the back of his tongue. He had consumed liters of water, but his body felt entirely drained. Yet, his hands operated on pure, subconscious muscle memory. Without a conscious thought, his right hand made micro-adjustments on the hydrostatic control handle, balancing the speed against the density of the crop. His left hand hovered over the steering wheel, keeping the 40-foot header aligned along the razor-thin border between standing wheat and cut stubble. His mind was drifting into a state of derealization, floating somewhere above the cab, but his body remained an obedient extension of the hydraulic valves. While the man inside was deteriorating, the S790 was operating in absolute, mechanical perfection. The giant green machine showed zero signs of strain. Its fluid temperatures remained dead center on the digital displays, the oil pressure was rock solid, and the massive diesel engine hummed with the same relentless, untiring power it had displayed when he first turned the key. The machine did not ache. The machine did not burn. It simply demanded diesel and forward motion, completely indifferent to the living organism sitting inside its glass tower. By 8 in the morning, the 24-hour mark slipped past without celebration or relief. Arthur had single-handedly cleared well over 1,100 acres. From the staging area, Dale radioed in, praising Arthur's superhuman pace, calling him an absolute legend over the crackling speaker. Arthur heard the words, but they sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from under 30 feet of water. He gave a single, toneless click of the microphone button in response, kept his eyes glued to the endless sea of gold, and kept pushing the green Titan forward into the rising heat. By the 26th hour, the sharp edge of Arthur's concentration had completely dissolved. His cognitive processing had slowed to a crawl. When he looked at the digital monitors mounted on the cab pillar, the numbers took several extra seconds to make sense. He found himself staring at the yield monitor, watching the numbers flicker, unable to immediately calculate what they meant. His brain was lagging behind the machine, reacting to the landscape half a second too late. On the two-way radio, his transformation was obvious to anyone paying attention. When the grain cart operators called in to coordinate and unload, Arthur no longer replied with his usual sharp, efficient instructions. His voice had dropped into a flat, monotone drawl, stripped of all energy and pitch. He spoke in slow, single-word answers, his speech slurred slightly around the edges like a man who had taken a heavy sedative. Dale radioed twice to suggest a relief driver, but Arthur's stubbornness had taken on an irrational, obsessive edge. He muttered into the mic that he was fine, that he was nearly through the section, and kept the hydrostatic lever pushed down. At hour 28, the John Deere's fuel gauge finally dipped into the red zone. Arthur was forced to bring the green monster to a stop in the staging area for a rapid refuel. When he cut the threshing mechanism and set the park brake, the sudden silence inside the cab was deafening. The absence of the engine's roar hit him like a physical blow. He unlocked the heavy cab door, swung his legs out, and gripped the handrails tightly. The moment his feet touched the solid ground, his knees buckled. His legs were weak, trembling violently from nearly 30 hours of near-total immobility. His ankles felt like water, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath his boots as if he were walking on the deck of a ship in heavy seas. A pit crew mechanic stepped up, offering him a bottle of electrolyte drink and a cold towel, looking at Arthur's hollow, bloodshot eyes with genuine concern. Arthur didn't speak. He stood against the massive rear tire of the S790, staring blankly at the dirt for 10 minutes while the diesel nozzle filled the tank. His face was pale, drawn, and dusted in yellow chaff. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to lay down in the dirt and surrender to sleep. Instead, driven by a dark, irrational momentum, he forced his trembling limbs back up the iron ladder, pulled the heavy glass door shut, and pushed the green Titan back out into the endless, blinding dust. By hour 35, the boundary between the physical world and the hallucinations of a starving brain began to disintegrate completely. Arthur had been awake for over 36 hours, perched high inside the isolated glass tower of the John Deere S790. The continuous, low-frequency vibration of the engine had numbed his nerve endings, and his optic nerves were beginning to short-circuit under the immense strain. It started in the extreme corners of his vision. As the combine churned steadily through the standing crop, rapid, dark shapes began darting through his peripheral view. They moved like swift, featureless shadows, flitting across the yellow dust kicked up by the 40-foot header. Each time Arthur snapped his head to look directly at them, the space was entirely empty, just the endless, swaying stalks of golden wheat feeding into the spinning reel. He blinked hard, rubbing his burning knuckles against his eye sockets until brilliant bursts of phantom light erupted across his retinas, but the tricks of the mind only intensified. The vast, empty field felt suddenly crowded. Out of the corner of his eye, he would catch the distinct movement of a figure running alongside the huge front tires, matching the precise 8-mile-per-hour pace of the combine. Yet, whenever he forced his tired neck to turn, there was nothing out there except the vast, indifferent dark. Audio distortions soon followed the visual trick. The low, constant hiss of static coming from the two-way radio speaker began to warp. To Arthur's ringing ears, the white noise no longer sounded like dead air. It began to resemble quiet, urgent whispers. It sounded as if two people were standing just behind his shoulder, murmuring low, unintelligible sentences right into the back of his neck. He reached over with a trembling, sweat-slicked hand and turned the volume knob completely off, killing the power to the unit. The silence inside the cab was instantly filled by the deafening, mechanical roar of the S790. Yet, even with the radio completely dead, the faint, hushed whispering seemed to persist, buried deep within the rhythmic churning of the giant steel rotor. Arthur's knuckles turned bone-white as he locked his hands around the leather-wrapped steering wheel. He kept his head fixed dead ahead, refusing to look to the left or the right, desperately trying to convince himself that the figures in the dust were nothing more than the ghosts of profound exhaustion. The sun began its second descent since Arthur had climbed into the cab, casting a bloody, bruised orange light across the endless northern plains. Long, unnatural shadows stretched out across the wheat fields, distortion warping every hummock and contour of the terrain. The air inside the cab felt heavy, suffocating, and thick with an unnatural tension. Arthur's vision was narrowing, reduced to a tight, hazy tunnel directly through the front windshield. He was working the far northern edge of the property, miles away from the rest of the crew, cutting a long, lonely pass along a ridge. The low-angle sunlight struck the dust clouds, turning the air into a shimmering veil of golden mist. Then, without warning, the mist parted. Standing directly in the center of his cutting lane, less than 30 feet ahead of the spinning 40-foot header, was a tall, dark shape. It was unmistakably human in proportions, upright, motionless, and standing waist-deep in the golden wheat. It did not flinch from the deafening roar of the 600-horsepower engine, nor did it turn away from the cloud of flying dust rushing toward it. It simply stood there, waiting in the crop, directly in the path of destruction. A spike of raw, icy adrenaline shot through Arthur's chest, shattering his exhaustion in a single, terrifying second. His instinct took over. He slammed his right hand backward on the hydrostatic control handle with all his remaining strength, yanking the drive system into full reverse and stomping on the service brake. The 18-ton John Deere S790 reacted violently. The massive tires locked up, tearing into the topsoil, and the front end dipped low as the heavy frame groaned under the sudden, violent deceleration. Dust, chaff, and pulverized straw billowed forward, completely engulfing the front windshield in a dense, blinding cloud of yellow debris. Inside the cab, loose items flew off the dash and crashed onto the floorboards. Arthur sat frozen in the leather seat, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his grip on the wheel. The engine idle dropped low, chugging with a heavy, mechanical beat as the threshing rotor slowed down. Through the thick cloud of settling dust, Arthur stared out through the glass, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps, waiting to see what he had just come inches from tearing to pieces. The thick, yellow dust cloud settled slowly over the crushed stubble, drifting away on the cold prairie wind. Arthur reached up with a trembling hand and slapped the main lighting toggle, activating every high-intensity LED light bar mounted across the roof and mirror brackets of the John Deere S790. A blazing wall of stadium-grade white light pierced the gloom, illuminating the field for 50 yards in every direction. There was nothing there. The space directly in front of the 40-foot header was completely empty. No crushed wheat, no trampled paths, no sign of a human or an animal. The standing crop stretched out in clean, undisturbed rows under the glare of the lights, swaying gently in the night breeze. Arthur leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the cool glass of the windshield, his bloodshot eyes searching every square inch of the dirt. The landscape was utterly desolate. Suddenly, the two-way radio on the console burst to life, shattering the quiet inside the cab. It was Dale's voice, sharp and anxious, cutting through the static. He wanted to know why Arthur's combine had suddenly locked its brakes and dropped off the live tracking system. Arthur grabbed the hand mic, his breathing heavy and erratic. In a rasping, breathless voice, he told Dale that someone was standing in the wheat right in front of his machine, that he had almost run a man down in the dark. A long, heavy pause hung over the radio wave. Across the property, back at the command trailer, Dale pulled up the real-time satellite telemetry screen. He cross-referenced the GPS transponders attached to every support truck, grain cart, and combine in the field. Arthur's green dot sat completely isolated on the far northern boundary, miles away from the rest of the fleet. There were no vehicles, no workers, and no cattle within 3 miles of his grid. Dale came back on the radio, his tone firm, flat, and uncompromising. He told Arthur that the map was clean, that there was nobody out there but him and the wind. He reminded Arthur that they had 4,000 acres left and a $40,000 bonus on the line, telling him his mind was playing tricks on him after 40 hours without sleep. Dale ordered him to pull himself together, engage the header, and keep cutting. Arthur sat in silence, looking out at the empty, glowing field, knowing what his eyes had seen, but feeling the cold reality of the machine pressing him forward once again. 2 o'clock in the morning arrived with a suffocating, pitch-black intensity. High above, the sky was a clear, icy dome, but down on the prairie floor, the world had shrunk to the narrow corridor of white light carved out by the John Deere S790's front halogen bars. Outside that beam, the darkness was absolute, a vast, silent ocean of blackness stretching for miles. Arthur no longer looked out his side windows. The peripheral hallucinations had escalated from fleeting flickers into concrete, terrifying forms. As the massive green machine churned steadily forward at 8 miles per hour, Arthur glanced into the oversized wide-angle side mirrors. What he saw made his blood run cold. Silhouetted against the clouds of illuminated dust and flying chaff kicked up by the rear tires, tall, shadowy figures were walking alongside the combine. They moved with an eerie, effortless stride, keeping exact pace with the 600-horsepower engine. They walked just beyond the edge of the light envelope, their shapes sharp and dark against the golden haze of debris. Whenever he dared to glance at the mirrors, he could see them, 3 or 4 figures on either side, flanking the 18-ton Titan like a ghostly escort. They had no recognizable facial features, no visible clothing, just solid, towering silhouettes marching relentlessly through the tall crop. Panic seized Arthur in a vice grip. His heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer, and a cold, slick sweat coated his neck and palm. Every instinct screamed at him to pull the hydrostatic lever back, cut the throttle, and lock himself inside the cab until sunrise. But a deeper, more primal terror held his hand steady on the controls. The thought of stopping the engine, of letting the roaring diesel engine die and being plunged into absolute, pitch-black silence in the middle of that empty field with those shapes standing right outside the glass, was far more terrifying than keeping the machine moving. He realized the machine was his only shield. As long as the 600-horsepower engine roared, as long as the lights burned and the 40-foot header chewed through the earth, he was safe inside his steel and glass tower. He refused to look at the side mirrors again. He stared straight ahead at the narrow strip of light, his knuckles white on the wheel, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth aching, driving the John Deere forward into the dark, entirely surrounded by the silent, walking dead. By hour 46, time had lost all meaning, collapsing into a single, unending nightmare of noise, dust, and light. It was 2 hours before dawn, the darkest and coldest stretch of the night. The temperature outside had plunged into the low 40s, but inside the sealed cabin of the John Deere S790, the air felt thick, oppressive, and stagnant. Arthur sat frozen in the leather seat, his eyes wide, dry, and bloodshot, fixed on the narrow path of light ahead. Then, at the center of the illuminated field, roughly 40 yards out, the shadow stepped out from the standing wheat. This was no fleeting blur at the edge of his vision, nor a trick of the dust. The silhouette was impossibly sharp, solid, and deliberate. It was a man, abnormally tall, standing dead center in the beam of the LED headlights, surrounded by the golden sea of crop. He stood completely still, facing the oncoming 18-ton machine, unbothered by the blinding lights or the deafening roar of the 600-horsepower engine. As the combine closed the distance, the figure slowly raised its right arm. It was not a frantic gesture, nor a wave of distress. The movement was smooth, measured, and unnatural, a slow, deliberate motion, waving Arthur forward, gesturing for him to bring the giant machine to a complete stop. It was an invitation, a quiet command from the dark, beckoning him to cease his endless, mindless forward motion. Arthur's hands reacted on pure survival instinct. He pulled the hydrostatic lever back into the neutral detent, engaged the park brake, and disengaged the threshing rotor. The sudden drop in sound was jarring. The high-pitched whine of the header died away, leaving only the deep, rhythmic, low-frequency thrum of the idling diesel engine. The tall figure remained in the headlights, 30 yards out, its arm lowered to its side, standing motionless in the gentle prairie wind. On the console, the radio crackled with static as Dale's distant voice called out Arthur's unit number, asking why his GPS position had locked up again in the middle of a straight run. Arthur didn't reach for the microphone. He didn't blink. He sat suspended in the cab's quiet glow, staring through the glass at the silhouette in the wheat, his heart pounding in his ears, completely paralyzed by the realization that whatever was out there was no longer just watching him, it was waiting for him. The two-way radio on the console was screaming now. Dale's voice burst through the small speaker in frantic, distorted bursts, demanding to know what was happening, why the S-790 had ground to a halt, why Arthur wasn't responding. The sound felt absurdly small, like a faint buzzing insect trapped on the wrong side of the universe. Arthur didn't even look at the mic. His hands stayed frozen on the armrest, his eyes locked onto the tall, dark figure standing 30 yards out in the brilliant white glare of the LED light. Slowly, as if moving underwater, Arthur unbuckled his seatbelt. The mechanical click echoed loudly in the quiet cab. He reached for the heavy glass door, pushed the latch, and swung it open. The cold Montana night air rushed inside like a physical force, striking his heated, sweat-slicked face like a bucket of ice water. The sudden plunge in temperature made his lungs seize for a fraction of a second. For 46 continuous hours, he had lived inside an insulated, climate-controlled bubble, bathed in artificial air and filtered light. Now, the raw smell of damp earth, pulverized straw, and bitter cold flooded his senses. He stepped out onto the iron catwalk, his boots slipping slightly on the steel grate. Below him, the massive 600-horsepower engine hummed in a deep, idling growl, sending steady vibrations up through his legs. Arthur reached for the handrails and began to descend the ladder. His knees were stiff, trembling so violently from exhaustion that his feet nearly missed the second rung. He caught himself, stabilized his weak limbs, and stepped down onto the soft, dark soil of the field. Ahead of him, in the center of the illuminated wheat, the silhouette shifted. The tall figure turned its back to the combine and began to walk away, slowly, smoothly, effortlessly slicing through the waist-high crop, heading deeper into the pitch-black abyss beyond the reach of the headlights. It didn't look back. It didn't hurry. It simply moved into the dark with a quiet, hypnotic certainty, knowing he would follow. Arthur didn't think about the $40,000 contract. He didn't think about Dale screaming into the dead radio, or the giant 18-ton machine idling uselessly behind him with its floodlights burning bright. Drawn by a dreamlike compulsion, his boots began to churn through the stubble. Leaving the running John Deere S-790 behind, Arthur walked away from the light and stepped straight into the blackness of the standing wheat. The waist-high wheat slapped against Arthur's legs, sharp and cold, as he stumbled deeper into the blackness. Ahead, the dark shape moved with a fluid, silent grace, gliding through the dense crop without stirring a single stalk. Arthur picked up his pace, his chest heaving, his boots catching on uneven furrows in the earth. The frigid prairie air burned in his throat, but he couldn't stop. A bizarre, magnetic force pulled him forward, compelling him to bridge the gap between himself and the figure. Behind him, the roar of the John Deere S790 began to wane. The deep, guttural thrum of 617 horsepower that had vibrated through his body for nearly 2 full days faded into a distant, metallic purr. The brilliant glare of the LED floodlights shrunk into a small, bright island of white in a sea of absolute pitch black. Arthur reached out a hand, his fingers mere feet from the figure's broad, dark shoulders. "Wait," he rasped, his voice a broken, paper-thin whisper in the cold night. "Who are you?" The shadow did not answer. It stepped across a wide sprayer track, and simply ceased to exist. 1 second the tall form was there, clearly defined against the dark sky, and the next, it vanished into thin air. There was no sound, no sudden movement, no rustle in the wheat. It dissolved like smoke into the freezing wind. Arthur skidded to a halt. He spun in a chaotic circle, his eyes wide and wild, tearing through the gloom. Nothing. The field was utterly barren. The tall, standing crop surrounded him on all sides, whispering softly as the bitter prairie breeze swept across the plains. He looked back toward the combine. The lights were gone, hidden behind a gentle swell in the terrain. He was completely, hopelessly alone in the dark, submerged in the freezing Montana wilderness. Panic gave way to absolute, bone-deep physical exhaustion. His trembling legs finally surrendered, giving out beneath him entirely. Arthur hit the dirt hard, tumbling onto his side in the icy stubble. The earth felt cold against his feverish cheek, but he lacked the strength to pull his limbs beneath him. His eyelids grew impossibly heavy, crushing down with the weight of 46 relentless hours. The icy sky above, filled with sharp, distant stars, began to spin before fading into absolute black. A heavy, dark curtain fell across his consciousness, erasing 2 whole hours from the timeline of his life. For 2 long hours, the digital telemetry board in Redline Agriculture's mobile trailer showed the flagship John Deere S790 locked in a state of suspended animation. The GPS coordinate dot sat completely frozen on the northern perimeter map, its engine diagnostics reporting a steady, idling RPM, but 0 ground speed. Dale Pute had yelled into the radio until his throat was raw, receiving nothing in return but cold, hollow static. Knowing that a 600-horsepower machine left running unattended in an open field meant severe trouble, Dale loaded 2 senior mechanics into the crew's heavy-duty 4-wheel drive pickup and tore across the bumpy access roads at high speed. They reached the scene to find a ghostly sight. The massive S790 stood alone in the dark, its engine idling with a low, steady thrum, its massive LED light bars cutting a blinding white swath across the empty wheat. The driver's side door hung wide open, allowing the freezing night air to circulate through the vacant cab. Arthur Vance was gone. Dale swept the cab with a flashlight, finding Arthur's phone, radio hand mic, and jacket sitting abandoned on the leather seat. Panic set in. The 3 men deployed spotlight bars from the truck's bed, casting sweeping beams of illumination across the surrounding acres, shouting Arthur's name into the freezing wind. Nearly an hour into the search, over a mile away from the idling combine, the truck's high beams caught a lone, staggering shadow stumbling through the waist-high crop. Arthur was walking in the wrong direction, heading straight out toward the empty, unmapped Badlands to the north. His jacket was missing, his work shirt was coated in yellow dust and dried sweat, and his lips were a bruised, dark shade of blue. He was shivering violently, his boots dragging through the dirt like heavy iron weights. When Dale leapt from the cab and grabbed his shoulders, Arthur looked straight through him with wide, unseeing eyes, muttering fragmented, incoherent sentences about a man in the dark who wouldn't stop walking. The crew loaded Arthur into the heated cab of the pickup, wrapping him in heavy wool blankets, and sped off toward the regional medical center in Shelby. By the time he reached the emergency room, doctors diagnosed him with severe hypothermia, acute dehydration, and advanced sleep deprivation psychosis. His body was running on a dangerous cocktail of shock and adrenaline. He was put on intravenous fluids, hooked to heart monitors, and sedated, leaving the medical staff to wonder how any human being had survived pushing themselves so far past the absolute breaking point. The sterile, clinical white of the hospital room was a jarring contrast to the endless, dusty golden horizon Arthur had stared at for 2 straight days. 3 days after he collapsed in the wheat, the steady, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor had replaced the deep, bone-rattling roar of the diesel engine. The door opened quietly, and Dale stepped into the room, looking older and tired, carrying 2 paper cups of stale coffee. He set one on the bedside tray and sat down in the heavy vinyl chair. He broke the silence by offering a gruff, practical update. The crew had stepped in, worked through the final night, and finished cutting the 12,000 acres just hours before the storm hit. The $40,000 contract bonus was secured. Dale pulled a folded bank check from his jacket pocket, laid it on the table, and told Arthur his share was safe, adding that the company would welcome him back behind the wheel as soon as the doctors cleared him to drive. Arthur looked out the small window at the concrete parking lot, his face pale and hollow, his hands resting motionless on the white sheet. He didn't touch the check. Without turning his head, Arthur quietly told Dale that he was done. He wasn't going back to northern Montana, he wasn't finishing the harvest season, and he would never step foot inside the glass cab of a combine harvester again. Dale tried to speak, to argue that it was just severe exhaustion talking, a bad run of luck brought on by sleep deprivation, but the cold, unwavering certainty in Arthur's vacant eyes cut the older man short. Dale nodded slowly, took a quiet breath, grabbed his hat, and walked out, leaving the check behind on the table. Arthur kept his word. Within a month of leaving the hospital, he moved away from the wide agricultural plains, settling in a small, low-ceilinged town along the mountain foothills. He took a quiet, predictable job working behind the counter of a local hardware store, spending his days in a windowless indoor aisle surrounded by fluorescent lights, metallic nuts, bolts, and organized wooden shelves. Months later, sitting in a dimly lit diner with an old friend who asked what had really happened out on the prairie that night, Arthur stared down into his black coffee. "Everyone thinks the machine failed," Arthur whispered, his voice steady and cold. "They think the heat or the hours made my brain short-circuit. But the John Deere didn't break down and the GPS was working just fine. The machine didn't fail. Something out in that black field was just waiting for me to break." The massive John Deere S790 never missed a single beat. After the mechanics brought it back to the central yard, wiped down the dust-caked glass, and cleared the system diagnostic codes, the 18-ton Titan went right back into the rotation. Years passed, seasons turned, and the green machine accumulated thousands of continuous engine hours, tearing through millions of acres of wheat, corn, and barley across the northern plains. To the farm management's ledger, it remained one of the most efficient, indestructible assets in the entire regional fleet. Yet, a subtle, lingering reputation quietly attached itself to Unit Number 4. Among the rotating crew of contract drivers and seasoned custom harvesters, the cab of that specific S790 became an unwritten legend. Nobody openly spoke about Arthur Vance or the night he walked off into the darkness, but the subtle discomfort remained. Replacement operators who sat in the leather air ride seat during the graveyard shift, between midnight and dawn, often reported an eerie, unnatural tension inside the cockpit. Late at night, when the cab was sealed against the freezing prairie wind and the high-intensity LED light bars carved a stark white path through the pitch-black fields, drivers found themselves constantly checking their side mirrors. They would catch themselves glancing nervously at the shadowy periphery beyond the light envelope, feeling an inexplicable, prickling sensation on the back of their necks, as if the silence of the field was leaning heavily against the glass, watching and waiting. Most drivers refused to run the machine solo past 2 in the morning, insisting on keeping a grain cart operator alongside them until sunrise. The land remains endless, vast, and indifferent to the fleeting lives that attempt to tame it. Season after season, the great mechanical beasts roll out across the plains, grinding through the crops under the cover of darkness, driven by relentless deadlines and corporate quotas. The cold, hard truth of the frontier remains unchanged. The iron frame does not ache, the 600 horsepower diesel engine does not weep, and the microprocessors guided by satellite transponders feel no fear in the dark. Steel never gets tired, but humans do, and out in the quiet, endless blackness of the night, the earth will always wait for the man inside the machine to break.